Thank you very much for coming. We're going to talk about the Doors today. Let's start by watching a little segment from a VH1 program about the top 200 pop culture icons. And Scooby-Doo was number 171. Jim Morrison, who was the lead singer for the Doors, was number 170.
America's first canine. Keeping it real.
We want the world and we want it.
He was the quintessential frontman. Jim Morrison was hot, poetic, tortured, and of course, usually shirtless.
I'll keep you wild on the road, you hand upon the wheel.
His band was the Doors, but Morrison was the chick magnet. The music was a mix of blues, psychedelia, and rock.
Come on, baby, light my fire. Come on, baby, light my fire.
You know, he was really a poet, so he kind of pushed those boundaries about what you could talk about in lyrics.
Peace Frog is probably my favorite. Remember that one? Nice songs on the radio, you know. It's like, green-eyed lady, fashion, blood in the streets is up to my ankle.
The band made 7 albums in only 4 years, but Morrison became infamous for his profanity and unpredictable behavior on stage. At a Miami concert in '69, Jim's rock star antics got him arrested, and the Doors almost fell apart. Morrison became the bad boy role model, but then the music died.
When the music's over.
Fighting depression and drug abuse, Morrison died in a bathtub of heart failure at the age of 27.
When the music's over here.
The early exit only cemented the legend of the Lizard King and his rightful place as the quintessential rock god.
He was like a rocket, you know. He was around for this brief period of time and did so much cool music that really affected the whole course of rock music. And then he was gone.
Okay, let's start with the actual presentation, and I'm going to call this Weird Scenes Inside the Gold Mine, Unlocking the Hidden Treasure Behind the Music of Jim Morrison and the Doors. Before we get started, let me mention about that fellow said that Jim Morrison died at age 27. And recently, Heath Ledger died, and there was an article in USA Today about icons that sort of become infamous or famous or live on past their time, and especially those who died young. And there is an undisputed A-list of pop stars who, you know, will live on, for quote unquote, forever and ever. And on that list was John Belushi, Jim Morrison, Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix, John Lennon, a few other people. And the issue was, is Heath Ledger going to be on the A list or the B or C list? And the Doors are part of pop culture. I was on United Airlines coming out here, and the Doors are on the playlist for classic rock, which also includes Led Zeppelin, The Who, the Rolling Stones, and Pink Floyd. And then you've got top 20 hits, Justin Timberlake, Fergie, Daughtry, Kanye West, Rihanna, Dave Matthews Band under Modern Adult, Maroon 5, Sheryl Crow. You've got classical, Beethoven, Mozart, jazz, Wynton Marsalis, Miles Davis. Anyway, the Doors are still out there. People can listen to them. I think they're one of the most important groups to come out of rock and roll, and maybe one of the most important musical groups that we'll ever hear. So let's get into it. Why the Doors? We're going to talk about several topics today. The first is why the Doors, and I'm going to go through a very brief history of the group. Then I'll talk about the second coming of Jim Morrison, then the third coming of Jim Morrison, and then we're going to look at his vision and some of the songs. Now, about the title of the presentation, Weird Scenes Inside the Gold Mine is a line from the Doors' most important and most infamous song. It's called The End. And that was on the first album. That song is 11 minutes and 35 seconds long. So weird scenes inside the gold mine is a line that sort of just hangs in the middle of the poem or lyrics, and we'll look at that later. Now, I mentioned in my subtitle that there's hidden treasure in the Doors. And the key to this treasure is hidden in plain sight. So we've had 40 years to look at the Doors. Most critics are absolutely keyless about what's going on here. And I'm going to say that the treasure, which is very important, is hidden in plain sight in the lyrics. But let me set the stage with a couple quotes that Jim would have agreed with, and the other Doors too. And I don't mean to minimize the contributions of the other three. But Simon Schama had a series on television recently about great artists, and they were more or less painters. But Picasso was one, and Caravaggio. Art is the enemy of the routine, the mechanical, and the humdrum. It stops us in our tracks with a high voltage jolt of disturbance. It reminds us of what humanity can do beyond the daily grind. It takes us places we had never dreamed of going. It makes us look again at what we had taken for granted. So when Schama talked about art, he said, you know, people tend to go into a museum and they're very quiet and looking at these paintings and don't talk too loud. And he said these artists had very tumultuous lives, you know, Picasso, Rembrandt, and their art was not supposed to necessarily soothe you and make you feel good. It was not supposed to calm you down. In fact, some of these artists, their art was supposed to get right in your face. And if you look at Picasso, Guernica, that very famous mural or painting that he had, is not supposed to make you feel good. I mean, it talks about, it depicts war, it depicts suffering. Now here's another one from Alan Hovhaness. Music is a religious thing to me. It has much to do with striking the deeper part of the human being, the deeper feelings of the soul and mind, as well as uniting man with nature itself. And Hovhaness created music that was attempting to do that, and the Doors were doing the same thing. Now the Doors were four young lads, I suppose you'd call them, who met in California in the 60s. They were considered one of the great groups out of the 60s. Jim Morrison on the left, Ray Manzarek, Robbie Krieger, and John Densmore. And they were creating music from 65 through 71. Jim and Ray were at the film school at UCLA. And Ray was the organist, the keyboardist. Robbie played guitar, and John Densmore was the drummer. And they got together in 65 and started making music, and were rejected by all these labels, had a tough time making it, but eventually they got signed and went on to create lots of different albums. Now, the Doors got their name from William Blake, who said, if the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite. And Aldous Huxley wrote a book called The Doors of Perception, which was about his experiments with drugs. So Morrison, who was known to take vast quantities of drugs, so the legend goes, as well as consume alcohol, which was his actual standby, his favorite, took the name The Doors from William Blake and then Aldous Huxley. And Morrison came up with this line, there are things known and things unknown, and in between are the doors. And we're going to see later how the Doors viewed themselves as a means of going from the known to the unknown through this door here. Now, Ray once said, that's the total immersion into the music. That's when you can take reality and stretch it and bend it so far that you come out on the other side. Music is sort of your gateway, your key to being absolutely real. Now, Ray, John, and Robbie did not necessarily share the same vision as Jim. Jim was the lead singer. He was the front man, as they call him, in rock and roll. He was the main songwriter. He was the lyricist. He was the guy that, on that video we saw, he was called the chick magnet. And Ray, Robbie, and John were absolutely integral to the band, but they didn't share the exact same vision as Jim. Plus, they lived more sane lives. They didn't die young. I talked to Ray a few months ago. I called him on his birthday to wish him happy birthday. I met him in 1972 along with the other Doors in Boston. I got a backstage pass to go see them. I told the promoters I was writing a book, and they gave me a backstage pass. But I've sort of kept in touch with Ray a little bit, and I called him, and he's still performing. Now, this is from a writer named Lillian Roxon, who put this together in 1969, which is only 2 years after the Doors arrived on the scene. More gloppy, pretentious, pseudo-realistic, hyper-literary, quasi-mystical prose has been written about the Doors than about any rock group ever. Whenever the Doors are mentioned in print, the similes fly like shrapnel in an air raid. They are unendurable pleasure, indefinitely prolonged. They are messengers of the devil. They are the Patricide Kids, the Los Angeles branch of the Oedipus Association, the boys next door, if you live next door to a penitentiary, a lunatic asylum, or a leather shop. So say the metaphor makers anyway. So you can imagine, this is 1969. We've had almost 40 more years of gloppy, pretentious, pseudo-realistic, hyper-literary, quasi-mystical prose to contend with. And the volumes on the Doors, there's probably about 40 books on the Doors. This video biography just came out, and I just want to read something from here because it's 40 years later approximately, and people are still talking about the Doors because there's a lot of mystery there. There's a lot of excitement. There's a lot of unexplained, what's going on here. That's one of the reasons their albums still sell in the millions every year. And then there are the lyrics. Before the Doors, only Dylan had really taken rock lyrics into the world of psychobabble and strangeness. But Morrison took it one step further with his quasi-poetry dotted with references to sex and death, infanticide, murder, doom and gloom, insanity, sexual innuendo, and the apocalypse. There was nothing remotely boy meets girl about these songs, although they even managed to touch on that as well, albeit in a strange and twisted way, in a series of powerful love songs that dripped romantic imagery. They may have been erroneously lumped in with the hippies, but there was nothing peace and love and flowers when you hear about the Doors. Their songs oozed a dark passion when most others on the charts were skipping along with sweetness and light. So if you look at what else was being produced, by the way, music in 1967, Ode to Billy Joe, which you may not have heard, was a big one. And then we had the Mamas and the Papas, and we had the Box Tops, and we had the Beatles, and we had Herman's Hermits, and lots of groups, lots of interesting music, very few with the kind of literate and compelling lyrics that the Doors represented. And there was a fellow named Jim Ladd, by the way, who was a very famous disc jockey out of Los Angeles. And he said in an interview, not an interview with the Doors, but he did a 4-part special on the Doors in the late 70s that he put on the radio. And he said in that the Doors, to him, were the most literate band to ever come out of rock and roll. And he had done hundreds of these interviews with groups on the radio. And he said after that 4-parter came out, they had more requests to rebroadcast the Doors interviews than any other group. And he still is a huge fan of the Doors.